Welcome everyone to our second of our CCG group webinar series. We're really excited today to have Karen Bradford and Dr. Paul Gartside talking about risk assessments for decision making during lockdown. I just want to go over a couple of brief housekeeping notes before we start. Please, all attendees, make sure your cameras are turned off just to save the internet bandwidth. We will be taking questions for our speakers, so if you could please submit your questions in the Q&A box, then one of our moderators will go through and ask them during the second half of the webinar. Please use the chat box for discussion amongst other webinar participants, and obviously just remember to be respectful and professional in your discussions. Just to let everyone know, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to view via our YouTube channel probably tomorrow. So without further ado, can I please present Karen Bradford and Dr. Paul Gartside from the British Library. Take it away.
Hello, we're going to be briefly talking about the way we've used risk assessments over this past period of 5 or 6 months as a decision-making tool to help us deal with the situation and various different aspects and issues that have arisen. I'm just trying to, there we go. Karen and I are going to split this presentation between us. I'm going to be talking initially. We are going to look at the way in which the British Library uses risk assessments and the benefits that provides for conservation and collection care, and also for the wider library. And then we're going to look at 2 specific risk assessments that we've carried out over this period. One dealing with risks and threats to the physical collection, which have become apparent. And this was a fairly general collection-wide, institution-wide assessment. And then Karen is going to look at a more specific, more detailed risk assessment, dealing with the way in which we have helped get the reading rooms up and running and used an assessment to balance the issues of the health and safety regulations with which we've had to abide, in combination with the requirement to protect the collection. And then we're going to have time for some questions at the end. So just to give this a little bit of context, we've been using risk assessments and risk management approaches more and more widely in the Conservation Department at the British Library over the past several years for a variety of reasons. My background is as a chemist, so I'm very used to using risk management approaches to inform what I do and as a practical decision-making tool. So when we started to develop the use of these techniques more within the department, we wanted them to achieve a certain set of goals, a certain set of criteria. So they had to be practical, they had to give us useful outcomes, they had to be pragmatic, so they were based on real decisions that we were going to be making and knowledge that we had of the collection. And related to that, they were very much experience-based. So whoever was completing these risk assessments, whoever was filling them out and then using them, would compile them based on their own professional experience, knowledge, and understanding of the collections, the way the collections are used, how the collection items interact with the environment, and the specific context of their use within the British Library. We wanted them to be versatile so that this method would be adaptable to as many different sorts of situations and circumstances as possible. And to help with this, they really need to be consistent so that you're using the same process over a range of different sorts of assessment, partly because this allows familiarity, which means they're then easier to complete and easier to understand, but it also helps with comparison between different risk assessments if you then wish to do that. And finally, the process should be rapid and reasonably straightforward to carry out, because this encourages people to use the process. I come across a variety of rather more complex methods of risk assessment, which unfortunately tend to only achieve the outcome of putting people off using them. So this defeats the whole purpose of them. They then become a burden, a millstone, and people avoid using them, so they gain no benefit from them at all, even if they ultimately complete them, because the paperwork requires that they do. They just become a rather empty form-filling exercise. So with all of those in mind, we then have now started to use risk management approaches much more widely at the library as a genuine decision-making tool, because this approach allows us to determine the likely effects of a possible course of action. It allows potential problems associated with that course of action to be assessed in a very systematic manner, and this then allows solution to these problems to be considered in a sensible and, again, in a systematic way. By comparing these two assessments, the assessment of the problem and the assessment of the potential solution, or in the case of multiple possible solutions, by comparing those possible solutions, it allows sensible decisions to be made about whether a course of action can go ahead, or which particular solution to a problem is the most useful and sensible one in the context of the activity. So overall, risk assessments can be used as part of a decision-making process, and because of the way they set out information, they are very useful when you are then justifying decisions, whether that's to colleagues, to other stakeholders, or to people in the wider community if you're talking about what you've done later on. As I've mentioned, the process of risk assessments provides a formal and systematic framework for considering problems that you might be dealing with. And one of the things that this helps with is it makes it easier to ensure that you've considered the full range of potential risks that you might encounter in your particular activity. And this really stems from the fact it is a formalised process. So it becomes much easier to ensure that you've considered all of the different aspects. One of the particularly useful benefits of this is in the way that it's possible to present the outcomes of the risk assessment using simple colour coding, kind of traffic light system, going from green through to red, with green being good, red being bad. This means that even if the problem that you're considering is very technical or very specialist within the field of conservation, the results that you're presenting are then very accessible to a non-specialist audience. And this is of particular use when you're presenting this information to other stakeholders who might not have the same range of experience and expertise as you have, so would simply become lost if you were relying on explaining the problem within the particular context of conservation and using conservation terminology. And finally, carrying out risk assessments in this manner provides a good record of decision making. It demonstrates your responsibility as a steward of the collection, and as I've mentioned, it helps justify the choices you made to other stakeholders. We've also found it helps to avoid arguments, because it's a fairly impartial process in which everyone can engage, and as a result of that, it also helps avoid entrenched positions where people stick to their guns and refuse to change their point of view about a situation, because it provides a forum within which these issues can be impartially discussed. This is the risk matrix that we use as part of the risk management process, and it's based on two factors, impact and likelihood, and many of you will be familiar with this kind of model of risk matrix. Likelihood represents the possibility that a particular risk or threat will occur, and impact measures its significance if it does occur. Both of these are rated over a scale of 1 to 5, and by cross-referencing these two aspects, it's possible to come out with an overall rating for the risk, in this case going from low through medium, through moderate, high, and then very high for our most significant risks. Having introduced the process, I'm now going to talk a little bit about the first major risk assessment we carried out as part of the lockdown situation, the COVID-19 situation. And this dealt with the issues that we were starting to face immediately on having to leave the building, and then deal with a range of problems which it became apparent were emerging. And some of these were the result of situations we knew that we had to deal with, but others became apparent because of situations that arose where, although we had robust procedures in place to deal with situations during normal operation, we realised that our procedures really didn't deal or address the possibility that there would be no staff or very few staff on site for prolonged periods. So we looked at the risks to the physical collection, and a similar parallel risk assessment was carried out to deal with the digital collection. We looked at the risks occurring over a variety of locations, principally our two major sites, St Pancras in London and Boston Spa in Yorkshire, but we also considered the effects on collection items and material which was off-site for various reasons, whether this was with external contractors for conservation, whether it was with our digitisation partners, whether it was off-site for loans for exhibitions in other institutions, or if it was out as part of an interlibrary loan, and that relates to material from the British Library on Demand collection. We broadly looked at risks falling into three categories, and these were the general risks. So these were the sort of risks that we would deal with on a day-to-day basis anyway, even during normal operation. So things like risks as a result of issues with the environment, pests and IPM-related effects, handling risks, those kind of things. We also looked at what we termed ongoing issues. So these were shorter-term issues or incidents which we had started to deal with immediately before the lockdown started, but which then continued into the lockdown period. And so we obviously had to then reconsider and think about in slightly different ways, because the way we were dealing with those incidents and events had to change as the lockdown occurred. And finally, there were the new risks, and these were the risks which emerged specifically as a result of the lockdown situation for a variety of reasons, but mostly due to the fact that we no longer had the vast majority of staff on site able to monitor or deal with events if and when they occurred. We looked at a variety of different types of risk within these various categories. So we broadly divided these up into building faults of various kinds. So these could be things like potential for burst pipes from windows, structural issues with the building, all of the kinds of things that in normal operation may very well occur, but would tend to be noticed very quickly by staff on site, be reported and then be dealt with in short order. Whereas in the lockdown situation, of course, with the dramatically reduced staff presence on site, there was a much greater risk that if one of these sorts of events did occur, it could persist for quite a long time before it was noticed and reported and could then be dealt with. We looked at environmental issues in a variety of different ways. So these included factors like temperature, humidity, and the environment, many of which we would deal with as part of our normal operation. But we also faced particular issues specifically related to the lockdown situation, perhaps the most significant of which was the danger that if the lockdown escalated and our estate staff weren't allowed on site anymore, that would then require them to shut down our environmental control systems. Unfortunately, that didn't occur, but obviously it was something that we had to deal with in the initial stages of the situation, because at that stage, it did seem that there was a very real possibility that it was something that we would have to deal with. Another category was the ongoing, or the regular issues that we deal with of IPM issues, the potential for mold, those kinds of things. And obviously, again, there was a danger that if we had an outbreak of any of these sorts of issues, it wouldn't be noticed as quickly as it would be under normal operation. Related to this, there was the danger of perishable materials, and some of these were found within the conservation department itself. Because we had to shut down so quickly, staff didn't get an opportunity to dispose of things like wheat starch paste, which had been made up. And whilst it was kept in the fridge, obviously that has a relatively limited lifetime. And when I actually went back on site for one day in early May, I then disposed of all of that. But we also had to consider issues with material which staff may have left in areas where there normally wouldn't be collection items, so office areas, things like food which may have been left in desk drawers, or plants that have been left on desks or windowsills, and obviously would start to decay over this prolonged absence from the building. We also had risks to do with fire, and we didn't feel that these were particularly elevated, but nonetheless they're part of our normal consideration of risks for the building. And we did have the slightly increased issue of the fact that our two newest buildings used reduced oxygen fire suppression systems, which again, if estate staff had to leave the site completely, there may have been the possibility that our oxygen reduction system, the machinery that supports that, would have to be closed down. We looked at the risks to collection items of unsupervised and unauthorised access to the sites. So unauthorised access is perhaps the simplest one. That's simply people getting onto site when they shouldn't be there. Unsupervised access was something that we dealt with. It was a slightly more subtle problem, and this was to do with the fact that for those staff that were on site, we're expecting them to take on a much wider range of duties than they would normally have done, which meant that staff who would not normally interact with collection items and so wouldn't require collection handling training or collection awareness in quite the same way might end up in areas of the building where there were collection items and might inadvertently interact with collection items, either because they didn't recognise them for what they were, or because they felt that they were doing what was best for those objects, but without that more in-depth collection care understanding of the issues. So we had to think about those sorts of possibilities. We also had to deal with items out of their normal storage. Some of these were the material that was off-site, but we also had items that were in display cases and which might have been being dealt with within the conservation department, these sorts of issues, where they probably weren't at any immediate risk, but we did have to consider the fact that they were outside their normal storage conditions for longer than would normally have been the case under our normal operational conditions. And this related particularly to issues such as potential dissociation of items or exposure to the environment in ways that they wouldn't normally experience. And I've mentioned items off-site already, but we also had to think about how we were going to look at those items, how we were going to request the return of them, how would we deal with them if they were returned. And with these, we decided in the majority of cases, given that we were dealing with partners with whom we were confident in their collection care abilities, that in the majority of the situations, we felt it was safest to leave items with those partners until we could return to site and start to, again, deal with things in a slightly more normal way. So we looked at all of these issues, and we looked at them in a variety of different ways for the different sites, in some cases for different types of collection items, where that had a significant impact on how we would look at the risks. And we came up with a total of 44 different risks over the various sites and collection areas. And within this risk assessment, we looked at the broad nature of the risk, the location of the items, the cause of the risk and the effects it would have, our initial assessment of the risk based on impact and likelihood using the risk matrix, which is shown at the bottom, mitigations that we would want to take, and who is responsible for putting those mitigations into place, the residual risk that will be left over once those mitigations have been put into place, and finally our mitigated risk level, again based on impact and likelihood. So as you can see, this is a very detailed document. It took us a couple of weeks of quite in-depth discussion within the department and liaising with other areas of the library to come up with this. But in the end, we felt that it dealt with all of the issues that we were likely to encounter, which might present a threat to the physical collections. And we felt that we could come up with the most appropriate mitigations for these issues. And in our initial stages, having assessed our risks before applying mitigations, we came up with, as I mentioned, 44 risks in total, of which 1 was of very high significance and 3 were of high significance. 2 of these risks, the highest and the second highest, related to ongoing issues that we were dealing with at Boston Spa, but where our approach to those issues had to be changed slightly because of the nature of the situation. The other 2 high-level risks dealt with issues at St Pancras in particular, and the first of these was concern over the maintenance and routine monitoring of the building in the absence of staff, because normally that's obviously a very, very busy site, and we rely on the widespread presence of staff there to be aware of potential issues and report them when necessary. And finally, it became very apparent to us that our existing salvage protocols weren't going to be fully compatible with the lockdown situation, because they didn't really deal with the possibility that it would be very difficult to easily get staff on site at short notice. So we had to reconsider that quite significantly, and that's something that Sarah Hamlin in particular was dealing with, and I believe that she has written a blog post about that. If you want to look at our reaction to that in more detail, I think it's either gone up or we're going up shortly. So, having identified those initial risks, we then had to come up with a variety of mitigations. And in general terms, I won't go into specific details of particular issues because otherwise that will take forever. But in general terms, we looked at prioritising the ongoing incidents and urgent issues which we're already dealing with but had to think about in different ways, and also objects which are outside their normal storage conditions. We made sure we ensured the continuation of collection care operations, and we did this using a combination of remote access, home working, and as time progressed, limited on-site activity. And we ensured that we could continue our normal monitoring over this process to become aware of any issues like problems with the environment. And in part to achieve this, we also ensured that we maintained close liaison and close working relationships with other departments within the library and with external partners. We identified areas where unauthorised or unsupervised access to the collection might occur. We limited access to collection areas on both sites to ensure that we could stabilise the environments as best as possible by minimising air exchanges and disturbance in the area and the environment in those areas. We arranged for the disposal of perishable materials where that was appropriate. I've already mentioned wheat starch paste, but we also worked with members of the estates team to look at disposing of plants which had died or food which had been left out on desks, things like that. We did a lot of work on planning for the return of staff to site and the potential recall of collection material. And we ensured that the resumption of library activities, whether those were internal or public facing, complied both with health and safety advice that we received from board level and with collection care requirements. And this is something that Karen is going to talk about in a little bit more detail. So having done this, we went from our initial set of 44 risks, of which 4 were very high or high in risk level, and by our mitigated risks then came out with a situation where we had dealt with all of our single very high level risk, and of our higher level risks, we'd reduced that to 2 high level risks, which we felt we couldn't completely mitigate any further, but by drawing attention to them, we could ensure that those issues were being constantly monitored in such a way that if they did arise, they would be dealt with, noticed and dealt with swiftly and appropriately. So that completes my part of this presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Karen Bradford, who's going to talk about some of the more specific issues dealing with particular operational issues.
Great, thank you, Paul. So I'm now going to present another risk assessment that we did for the preparation for the library reopening to the public. I'm going to explain a bit about the background, which is this slide, but then I will go into detail about the risk assessment, including the risks, mitigations, residual risks, and then finally the outcomes and ongoing work that we're currently doing. So once we got the go-ahead from the government, the library began planning a phased reopening of the reading rooms and staff areas. As part of this, there were concerns about contracting COVID-19 from surfaces, so conservation was asked to advise on the potential impact on the use of collection items during the pandemic. So this was we were specifically asked to advise on the need for a quarantine period for collection items and the use of PPE such as gloves for staff and readers. I think this is because people are used to coming to us basically for advice. It became very apparent that we're being pulled into health and safety issues that were outside our roles and expertise. And this isn't to say that we were not concerned with the health and safety aspects of things, but essentially they are decisions that we're not able to make. So one of these issues is around quarantine. So while we can advise on how the activity should be carried out, such as length of time, implementation, etc., the decision of if we do in fact need a quarantine period needed to be made at a corporate level. Another thing we were asked to advise on is the use of gloves. And again, staff usually come to us for advice on gloves, but it's in relation to the use of collection items. And in this circumstance, it was outside our remit to decide if this was sufficient to protect people against a virus. As more discussions took place, it became very clear that the waters were getting muddied, and the only way to separate the two entities was to carry out a risk assessment. So this is a screenshot of the risk assessment, which is very similar to the one that Paul used. But I just wanted, the details isn't necessarily important because I'll go over it in subsequent slides. But what this just shows is the format and the layout. And you can see my cursor, but we looked at the risk, the description, and the causes. We then scored those, then implemented mitigations, looked at residual risk, and then rescored. So 6 risks in total were identified, which is much better than the 44 of the previous one. The ones in bold are our top 3 risks based on the 10 agents of deterioration. We did find that there was an additional handling risk from soiling, and then 2 new additional risks such as reputational and compliance. So handling, we identified as physical damage to objects as a result of inappropriate handling due to staff and readers being concerned about contaminated surfaces. Also, objects might be carried, positioned, or opened in ways that leave damage, and staff may be unfamiliar with format and certain collection types, especially if we have reduced staff and they're not used to working in certain reading rooms. So handling from soiling, we identified this as damage caused to objects from exposure to water, sanitizer, or moisturizer on hands of staff and readers as a result of well-being measures. And there's also damage to objects from direct contact with disinfectant, so on desks and things like Dissociation was the risk of objects becoming mislaid or lost as a result of new policies on quarantine, storage, and periods. Normal processing procedures will be altered. New staff may be unfamiliar with areas and procedures. Objects may be temporarily stored in new areas, and normal tracking procedures may be disrupted. So there's a lot of disruption in terms of the normal day-to-day work that staff are used to. So we also identified security, and this is directly in relation to fulfilling any quarantine requirements. Objects may be stored in areas which do not meet normal, strict BL security standards. And then also due to physical security measures or increased accessibility in areas. So we hadn't identified specific places for a quarantine, but they may have to be in places that were not secure storage. And then we have reputational, which is the prevalence of inappropriate, misunderstood, and contradictory advice in the media and from a variety of official sources that may lead staff and readers to believe that the BL is not following best practice advice to quarantine items, reduce transmission, or provide and use PPE. And then finally, we have compliance, which is defined as staff and readers that may not comply with the well-being, quarantine, and handling recommendations, leading to increased risk of exposure to contaminated surfaces. And as you will see, we do have a high risk. So that was reputational, and it's essentially, a lot of that is out of our hands. But then we also have two high risks, which are compliance and dissociation. So on to the mitigation. So we list lots of mitigations against every risk. And again, I won't go into every single one because it would take too long. But there were a lot of commonalities between the mitigations. So the main mitigations we saw throughout the assessment were what's on screen. So by ensuring guidance and messaging is clear and informed, and by providing training for new processes and procedures, mitigates the risk of mishandling, security, and dissociation. But it also has the added benefit of reducing reputational risk by reassuring that the public and staff that the BL is following best practice procedures. Also by ensuring staff have the appropriate amount of time to carry out new procedures, reduces the risk of items being mishandled or mislaid. By providing approved sanitizer and alcohol wipes, ensures readers are not bringing in their own cleaning equipment and reduces the risk of damage from readers trying to disinfect them themselves. And then finally, probably the most important thing is ensuring clear communication and regular reviews are carried out. This is key. This is a key mitigation in every single one of the 6 risks. So now moving on to the residual risks. So despite all the mitigations that we put in place, there were some risks that still remained. Handling risks were still elevated due to the slightly higher than normal levels as staff and readers adjust the new handling procedures. Also, it's out of our control in the fact that readers may still try and wipe or spray collection items or handle them with undried hands. There are still dissociation risks. Again, they're elevated to slightly higher than normal levels as staff adjust to new procedures. Normal security risks are still present. Reputational. So this is an unprecedented situation and the concerns still remain despite all the mitigations and communications and things like that. And there is still a risk of deliberate non-compliance. So as you'll see, we couldn't eliminate all of them completely, but we'll effort to reduce them to moderate or low. And that's a level that we think is manageable. So immediate outcomes and ongoing work. So we produced a guidance document for staff to refer to. We also provided training sessions for staff on both the new procedures and a handling refresher as well. We have communicated the new procedures to all staff, and we were also able to contribute to signage in the reading rooms. We worked with the press office to produce a Q&A document for readers and contributed to the communication on our website and social media. We are regularly engaging with staff and getting feedback from reading rooms pretty much on a daily and weekly basis. We're also conducting regular research and keeping up with the latest guidance. And we have found that the Realm project is a particularly useful resource. So now that the groundwork is done, we are able to adapt our guidance to the changing situation as the library begins to open up more and more. And then we are also reviewing and updating our guidance document on a monthly basis. So just to sum things up, using risk management approach has helped us make clear and informed decisions during this unprecedented time. We are able to identify risks to the physical collections across the whole of the library. We were also able to assess activities in light of revised working practices and public access. And then finally, we're able to offer advice and make recommendations in a way that can be easily adapted to this changing situation. So I just wanted to thank you all and Paul, but also I would like to thank Sarah Hamlin, our lead preventive conservator, and Cordelia Rogerson, our head of collection management, for working with us on these two projects. I will go ahead and suppose I'd stop sharing screen now.
Are you happy for me to take over and start asking questions?
Yeah, Kaylee, do you want me to start my video?
It's up to you. If people want to just switch to gallery view, and if you and Paul are happy to stay on video so that people can kind of see you responding, that would be great. So I've got a question here. I have actually got some questions of my own, which I might try and sneak in. I've got a question here from Megan asking, will taking care of staff, food, plants, etc. lead to a wider policy change at the British Library? And I don't know which, I'm going to let you guys fight it out as to who answers what questions.
That's probably more your area.
Yeah, one would only hope. It's actually something, so our food and drink policy has been on the cards to be revised since 2008. And we hit hurdle upon hurdle. And I think that this is a really good example of why we do need to revise the policy. And I think it's actually a knock-on effect for quite a lot of our policies. And I think COVID's kind of brought out a lot of different things in all of our minds, really. So hopefully this will mean that we can push things through. It tends to be the unions that we get the most pushback from. But yeah, in a nutshell, I hope so.
I mean, has it altered the, in terms of staff room areas, or is this specifically looking at staff related, or is this also public?
So it's staff related. So public spaces are pretty well managed, but we don't have a lot of dedicated breakout space in the behind the scenes area. So we have like staff canteen, but we don't have a lot of specific areas that we can go away from our desks. So a lot of people will eat and drink at their desks because they just don't have anywhere else to do it. Yeah, so hence why they may have left, I don't know, a tin of biscuits or, you know, some tea bags or something like that in their desk. We just don't know. It basically, it's unquantifiable.
Yeah, I mean, where I work, we've got lockers, but there was still that slight panic of where you're not allowed back in. It was like, what actually did I leave in that locker? And yeah, had that slight panic. I've got a question here from Deborah Walton. She asks, what changes have you made to salvage and emergency plans?
Do you want me to take that, Paul?
That's probably more your area.
Yeah, so I am on the salvage team. We have revised our on-call procedures. So what we've done is, in terms of minor incidents, the salvage team will only be called out in very extreme circumstances. It's slightly changed now with the fact that we can get around a bit better and lockdowns eased a bit, but in the initial phases, it was basically last resort to where the salvage team would get called out. We still remained a rota, so there's 2 people on call every week, but they're using their own personal phones and things like that. So we normally have dedicated salvage phones. So that was a change. We also revised our environmental parameters. So occasionally the salvage team would be alerted to the fact if there was a heightened RH or something went wrong in the environment. We occasionally have problems with steam lances and things like that. Now, I'm the protocol for that rather than the salvage team being called out, because I'm able to deal with things like that remotely. So those were a few, like I said, and we did a whole bunch of virtual training as well, which is very nice because actually we got a lot of training under our belt, which we don't normally have time to do. And again, it's not about actually recovering items, it's more about the theory behind it, but it's been really useful as well. And like I said, Sarah's doing a blog post, which will detail everything. So I've been a little bit out of the loop because I'm just a team member rather than driving the changes. So.
And presumably that blog post is accessible to anybody. So if people go onto the British Library
yeah, so if you go onto our go on the website, go into our conservation pages, and then you can read all of our blogs from there. It's really easy format.
I've got a question here. Rob Sedman asks, do you have remote access to your environmental monitoring systems?
Yeah, so we use EMS, and that seems to actually been a bit of a lifesaver. I did have a problem with one of my repeaters. So something happened, someone turned it off, and some of our signal was lost, but it was easy. So I had to go back in on Monday. I just actually had to turn on another repeater, but it's been very reliable and very useful.
Were there any major spikes? Because obviously it was very hot as well during those periods. So were there concerns with?
Well, the environment's been much more stable with the public and staff not being around. I'm sure a lot of people have found that. We struggle with humidity and actually taking steam out of our system every summer. So we didn't notice anything at all. And in fact, I would normally alert estates if there was an issue. They're on it 24/7 anyway, but I really was a bit lenient, and nothing majorly went wrong. Luckily, knock on wood.
Sure. It's always good. Always good. So someone else has asked a question here of, would the British Library consider sharing their virtual training resources? Is that something that's beyond your guys' kind of say?
Well, we're in the process. So the training that we did with the handling and the change in the COVID procedures, they're kind of bespoke to our team, so they might not be useful at a wider level. But what we are doing is we're trying to do training videos, which will be a lot more general. So on a variety of different preventive topics. And yeah, and in a nutshell, I don't know if we can, I don't think it's a problem if we shared it, but I would suggest if anybody does want to contact me about that, I can ask Sarah Hamlin. My email address, my BL email address should be on the care collection pages on Icon. I should have put that up, or I can put it in the chat. So if you want to, if it's something I can't answer, I can always.
If you guys are happy to, maybe at the end we'll just pop your email addresses in the chat. If you're happy to share that information, that would be, I'm sure that'd be fantastic. I know you talked a little bit about the reputation, and I just wondered if, because the British Library is seen as such a high standard, was there felt additional pressure felt that you were setting a particular standard? And I think that kind of links into the training programs. Are there people that are then coming to you to ask for those kind of standards of care?
Yes, I think we certainly felt that was a particular level of pressure, perhaps a particular level of scrutiny on us as a national library for what we were doing, and we're very aware from situations in the past where, for example, if people are seen handling books in the library's collection without wearing white gloves, this always produces a shower of complaints from the public, even though we would generally not recommend wearing gloves when handling collection items. From issues like that, we're very aware that to a certain extent we are in the public eye, and that if we are seen doing what is perceived to be the wrong thing, people will take note of it and complain about it. So that was something that we were particularly concerned about. And its reputational risks are something that we are increasingly incorporating in the majority of our risk assessments in any case, because over the period that we've been doing this, it's become very obvious that, especially with the increased use of social media, the increased use of things like Twitter, where people will post about their immediate reaction to things. It's very, very easy for someone who comes away with a bad impression of the library or what we're doing to very, very quickly make that public, and to then sort of snowball completely beyond the control of the original person who posted this. So it's increasingly something that we're thinking about with any activities which have either a partial or fully public-facing aspect to them.
Yeah, it's kind of, I was having a discussion the other day actually with somebody about censoring conservation, and that being maybe something that would be good for a future topic for a webinar. I've got questions coming in, so I mustn't get distracted. I've got a question here from, and the name's coming up as SNK2, and they have apologised for the fact that it's coming up as anonymous, but we've got your question, so it's okay. This may be a little too specific, but which sanitizer and alcohol wipes does the British Library use and approve?
I don't know if you remember which ones we came up with in the end, but I do remember at the beginning of this period, when it became apparent that this sort of situation was likely, that we actually revised the work we'd done for the SARS outbreak a few years ago, and we specified things like sanitizer gels, which were alcohol-based, but specifically ones which didn't contain things like moisturizing agents or perfumes, because we recognised that an awful lot of them did contain these additional agents, and it was those kinds of materials which were most likely to end up being transferred to collection items. Karen, can you remember any more of the specific details about the ones we finally recommended?
I know Purell's on the list, but yeah, I can't remember. We think there's 6 that we pointed out. I can't remember the brand names for all of them, but it's ultimately everybody's struggling to get hand sanitizer at the moment. So we're actually just advising people just stick to the no fragrance, high alcohol content rule. And we'd rather people have protection than none. And then we're also saying with alcohol wipes, so I have specific ones I use for mold cleaning, like cleaning surfaces for mold, but what we were advising is that they just aren't the really wet, kind of soapy style wipes, that that they evaporate quickly. And it seems to be fine. I was on site, like I said, on Monday, and they all seem to be good. I mean, we try to be strict, but at the end of the day, we just want people to have PPE and be safe and all of that.
It's a very difficult balance. I've got a question here from Lorraine Bryant, who has asked, is there a blog from Paul on risk assessments or a template, as per the example he showed? It'd be useful to share with colleagues. Can we all steal your template?
I'm more than happy to share those documents with people. I run workshops on this kind of thing every now and again. And if there's call, I'm more than happy to run another one of those. But equally, all of the documentation, the spreadsheet format to set out these risk assessments, I'm more than happy to share with anyone who's interested.
Okay, so maybe we can help with that as the CCG team in some way, if there are people who are interested. If you're happy to, Paul, try and make it available for people, because I am sure it's, yes, I'm with Lorraine. I'd quite like to steal that template. I've got another question here. How do you balance staff cleaning for COVID-19 versus what you suggest is best ways to clean for protecting the collection? So you've kind of touched on that a bit, Karen, but is there any other main considerations you guys have had to take into account?
In terms of what, enhanced cleaning, or I'm a little confused with the question.
So yeah, the question just asked that, and I apologise if I'm going a bit funny because it's coming up saying my internet connection is unstable. But it's saying about the cleaning for COVID-19 versus cleaning to protect objects or to protect collections, and any suggestions for the best ways to balance these two.
Okay, that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
We're doing enhanced cleaning in public spaces and on touch points and all that, like, which I'm sure everybody else is. In terms of cleaning collection items, there's not a lot of people on site, and the people that are on site are they're not worried about cleaning collection items at the moment, if that makes any sense. So essentially, there is no real balance to be had. It's really more of focusing on cleaning surfaces that we can and keep protected from the virus versus cleaning collection items, if that makes any sense. What we were worried about is potentially that readers may just forget what they're doing and try and wipe something down with a wet wipe or something like that. But we don't, we're not doing active conservation cleaning at the moment, because it's not one of the priorities at the moment.
I guess it's that quarantine period, which is the big, seems to be the main thing that is the consideration under a lot of, for a lot of archives and places like that, to try and mitigate any transfer to people who are carrying out the cleaning. So we don't want our conservators getting ill. So yeah, protect them as well. I might just slip in one of my questions. You were talking about working with kind of estates and all that sort of thing, and I just wondered if you could maybe talk a bit about how the relationship maybe has changed with the other departments that you've had to work with, and more about that relationship, because I think that that's something that a lot of people are kind of interested in and have kind of had a part of that experience. And it'd be interesting to see what it was like for you guys.
Paul, you happy for me to
comment? Yes, please do.
We are very, very lucky to have incredibly good relationships with lots of different departments. It's probably the reason why we get asked these questions that kind of blur the lines of conservation and other people's departments as well. So with the states, they've been right from the very beginning, they've been on board, and we're on Zoom calls all the time. Apologies if you can hear that. So they have been great. Like I said, the press office have been really engaged with us to do communications outside for the public. A lot of the curatorial areas have come to us about, in the digitization areas and things like that, about what we should do in terms of quarantine for their items. So everybody's been really engaged with us. I would say that the relationships have even gotten better, and the fact that we can do things virtually now rather than in person, it actually makes it a little bit more accessible. I don't know, Paul, if you've had the same experience.
Yeah, I think we're certainly in a very lucky situation to start with, that we had, even long before this situation started, we had very, very good relationships with the estates department and the like, and in part that stemmed out of a series of regular meetings we have with them every couple of months. So that's enabled us to be much more aware of one another's roles and to work collaboratively on problems as they arise. So actually, when this whole situation started, we were in a very strong position to continue to work on that in a collaborative way and ensure that there was a very strong liaison, strong collaboration with what we were doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fantastic. That makes the place run so much smoother when everyone can kind of collaborate together and appreciate each other's roles. I think that's really important. I've got a question here from AMS3, and they've asked, are you following realm guidelines for quarantine times, and are you quarantining different materials for different times?
Well, do you want to take this?
Probably do part of this each.
Do you answer that?
We are looking at the realm advice, and that's informed a lot of our decisions about how we're quarantining collection material. We decided not to go down the path of quarantining different types of material in different ways because we felt this placed too much complexity on the sort of front of house staff who would have to be making those decisions as they were receiving material back from readers. And we felt not only was that outside their normal working area of expertise, but potentially it would place a lot of unfair pressure on them if, for example, a member of the public disagreed with the length of time that something had to be quarantined because they wanted to get access to that material again. And if it was felt that there was some sort of leeway or some sort of possibility for some materials being quarantined for, that presented rather more of potential for that sort of pressure to be placed on staff. So by having the uniform 3-day quarantine period, we felt it was both easier to carry out, much more straightforward in terms of logistics, and fairer on the staff who are actually having to carry out. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Gary?
No, that's sums it up.
So I know we're sort of running out of time. I did wonder about the feedback that you've had from kind of staff and also from visitors, sort of gradually opening back up in terms of the kind of the procedures and those sort of things that have been put in place, the feedback that you've had from them.
We have had really good feedback from staff point of view. I think that they feel like we've really taken their kind of health and everything into consideration, and they feel safe and secure. So that is good. And they don't feel pressured time-wise and things like that. In terms of reading room staff, I hear that a lot of readers would like more collection items. They're also a little upset that the open access material's been barred because there's no way to quarantine that or monitor that. So that's been a real big source of complaint. I mean, I suppose if you're going all the way to the British Library to conduct your research, you want as much of the resource to be available as possible, but that's a little bit out of our hands. They haven't complained about they've understood generally about the precautions that we're taking, why we're taking it, and I think that that is the better alternative to not having any precautions. I think there probably would have been more complaints.
Yeah, I mean, I'm based at a records office, and I think they've had similar kind of feedback from people where it's that although people would like for it to go back to how it was before, they realise that there has to be additional precautions in play. Well, I think that's all of the questions that I've got here answered. So unless anybody has wants to slip anything, although I don't think we actually have time. No, we don't. So I take that back. Don't ask any questions. Otherwise, I will hand you back over to Amy.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who's attended today, and the biggest thanks to both Karen and Paul for the really insightful and educational talk. A huge thank you to Kaylee for being such a great moderator and question asker again. And thanks also to Siobhan for all her help behind the scenes. Just to remind everybody that the final of our first 3 webinar series is next week, so please log on to Eventbrite and sign yourself up. It's going to be a really interesting panel discussion about salvage and emergency response through COVID and then post-COVID. So yeah, please hope to see everyone next week virtually. And thanks again to Karen and Paul. Everyone have a good rest of your night.